My name's Anita Harriet. This is part 3 of our webinar series. Primarily what we're doing is we're looking at, sadly, the impact of COVID on the tangible asset marketplace, specifically focusing on today on art, cars, and wine. And we've brought some excellent experts to speak to everyone. I'm very happy to introduce Brian from Haggerty. He is one of their top valuation specialists, really, really great reputation. And I know does lots and lots of webinars and is very knowledgeable. We've also brought Charles Curtis, who's the founder of Wine Alpha. Charles is former, I believe, former Christie's, and very, very knowledgeable. And we have Nick Alexander, who is also with Haggerty and manages the Western Territory, who will be moderating today's panel. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Nick, who will begin.
Hi, Anita, thanks so much. And we thank you for allowing us to have a nice conversation with you this morning. So thank you. And to everyone on the call, welcome. We're glad that you're with us. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are sitting. As Anita said, my name is Nick Alexander. I'm the Regional Vice President for Haggerty in the Western Territory. And if you're not familiar with Haggerty, we are an automotive lifestyle brand specializing in writing the insurance policies for collector vehicles. Bottom line is we love cars and we love talking about cars and we love talking to people who love talking about cars. So it gives us great pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you today. Along with me is my colleague, Brian Raybold, as Anita mentioned, and Brian is the VP of our valuations team in the for North America. And Brian will talk all day about cars. So they brought me in to be the moderator, so he didn't go too long. So with that being said, Brian, I'm going to turn this over to you, and I'll let you run with it. Thanks.
All right. I have a few slides, actually. Are we going to have Anita speak first? Anita, you're on mute right now if you want to start off.
Okay, hi folks. I'm going to start just because it's the order of the slides. So I think that probably makes the most sense. And I know I have an idea what Nick's going to ask me, which is what the heck is going on in the art market right now. So the first thing I want to do is define what we mean by the art market, because I know there's a lot of confusion about what that actually means. So the art market is essentially how deal flow happens with fine art. And deal flow happens in 3 ways. It happens through auctions, it happens through dealers, and it happens through private transactions. Those are the 3 primary ways in which deals happen. And it's kind of a triangular relationship. It's very incestuous. All the different actors in the market work together, even if it doesn't seem so. And then I would also throw in museums there. Although museums are not actual transactors, they have a huge impact on the market. So that's the first thing I want to mention. The second thing I want to mention is that when we're looking at auction sales, we are traditionally we really mean live auctions in which people can walk into an auction house and raise a paddle. That market has changed dramatically with COVID. So the big focus today when we look at auctions, and I know it's going to be right across the spectrum, right? Wine and cars will be doing the same thing. What is the impact of ending live auctions in the current marketplace on the value of what we own, on your decision-making in terms of sale, and your decision-making in terms of acquisition? Right, so it's the online auction marketplace. Now, online has been there for quite some time and has increased over time. Traditionally, we've looked at online sales for lower value objects, right? We would never have even considered in a million years, for Christie's or Sotheby's to offer a $10 million work online. And that's primarily due to the fact that a lot of what we always think about with very expensive works of art are 1, a rarity factor, but 2, you want to see these objects in person, right? Who wants to spend $10 million on something they haven't seen in person? in which they haven't done a condition report in person. So that's the real rub here, is whether or not people will be willing to buy objects from a JPEG and a video when it exceeds a certain price point. The current auction results that we have seen at this point from COVID up to today tell us some very interesting things, which I already anticipated but have been confirmed with stats. The first is when we compare March 2019 to March 2020, wait for it, sales are down 76%, right? No surprise, right? And that has a lot to do with one simple thing, supply, right? Supply is way down. In addition, the works of art that have gone to sale have been at a lower price point. What you see in front of you are the upcoming sales. And what I want you to pay particular attention to are what you see in June and July. What Sotheby's and Christie's and Phillips have done is basically moved all of their main auctions, the principal auctions, to end of June and July. They have their fingers crossed that they will be able to have live auctions. But if you do the math in your head carefully, think about if they do not actually have people back in the auction houses till early June, putting together a live auction is going to be a very challenging scenario, because anyone that has worked auction knows this requires photography, cataloging, marketing, etc., right? If you can't do that, you don't have an auction. So what we're all paying very close attention to is whether or not at the end of June, early July, we will see important works of art, which have never happened before, going online for sale, and what impact that will have on the market. Are we ready to hit a button on our computer and buy something if we haven't seen it in person? In addition, we'll be looking in London, where we're going to be seeing sales in July as well, to see the extent to which, yes, are there actual live sales. So the auction marketplace is down dramatically. Now, I know all of you out there are starting to think to yourself, ooh, opportunity for a really good buy. At this point in time, we're looking at a couple things. What we are seeing, mostly lower value pieces are sold online. And as a result, and supply is down dramatically. We are not at crush time, where major estates are flowing through the auction marketplace at pennies on the dollar. However, when we have tracked pricing has gone down. And again, these are lower valued pieces, below $100,000. Prices have gone down. Today it was reported that in 2019, the average price for an object that went through auction was $34,000, and today it's $11,000. That's a big, big difference. All right. So that's some of what we're looking at.
Oh, Anita, we got you on mute right now.
And we're looking at June and July again for Phillips. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, let's look at the dealer marketplace. So we looked at auction. We have a low supply. We are looking to the extent to which they're willing to put expensive things online and how they're going to handle these logistics. Looking at the dealer market has been particularly interesting. It's first of all a situation where many, many galleries are living on pennies, right? They don't make a lot of money. And so this has literally been a devastating impact on the gallery marketplace. The kingpins of the dealer marketplace obviously have, a little bit more wiggle room, but what is specifically fascinating about what is happening is that the dealer marketplace has always been very opaque, right? It is not a transparent marketplace. And it's like that for a reason, that the very expensive, very important things are held for special clients, right? They are not public. Pricing is never public for significant pieces. What we are seeing is the development of several online platforms. So we have online viewing rooms, and this is an example of one of the online viewing rooms. We have online sales. Now, they have sold online on sites like Artsy, but what we're seeing now are very expensive things being placed online. And in the most curious but obvious marriage, Sotheby's is now working with the major dealers, not all of them, but some of them, and the dealers are actually showing artwork on Sotheby's online platform. So this is a very strange bedfellows, but we know that, they have worked together unofficially, and now this is like a very public relationship with pricing. So the way in which I think the major dealers are going to hope to get through this is, one, working with the auction houses with private deals. Two, using online platforms, including art fair online platforms. And three, quietly doing as many private deals as possible. So what's going to happen with values? And this is supposed to
Anita, just a quick question here that came in.
Yeah.
As far as, does it vary by, furniture versus art versus a different, art piece? So can you talk about that? Will it vary by
Big
piece?
Time.
Yeah.
Well, you actually can just take art and break that down into 1,000 different little pieces. So for instance, if we look at American art, which is artwork up until 1945 essentially, that is a very different marketplace than the post-war contemporary marketplace, and that's very different than the modern and impressionist marketplace. Post-war contemporary is still the king, for sure. What I do think we're going to see is that a lot of emerging artists with no auction secondary market, are going to go, those values are going to go down dramatically, which I've always anticipated, but now I think it will be a fact of the matter. So I think we're going to see a lot of supply of emerging artists. If we look to other areas of the tangible asset marketplace, think about the logistics of it. It's not that hard to ship a painting on FedEx to an auction house, but try getting furniture to an auction house today, right? Just the logistics of major things is a big, big problem. However, sites like First Dibs, that focuses primarily on decorative works of art and fine art and jewelry, that you can still actually have it in your house or in a virtual location and try to sell it. So I think the biggest hit will be in, which is already hit so hard, furniture and decorative arts. I think to come out the strongest will be post-war contemporary and jewelry.
Okay, great. Thank you.
In terms of the next 6 months, this has always been my view, but it continues to be my view that the cream does always rise to the top. And what I mean by that, and I know it will be a complementary analysis with wines and with cars, is that what we call blue chip assets that have all of the bells and whistles that determine it as a good asset acquisition with a strong secondary market. In my opinion, those values will hold. I think most people will be hesitant to enter them into the marketplace, at least until November. We have moved all of our major sales to November because we think that's the best strategy. So I think that those values will hold. Where I think the values will drop is in what I call second and third tier objects. And I can talk a little bit about what I mean by a second and a third tier object. So I basically have the ABC rule when it comes to looking at an object and whether it's first tier, second tier, third tier. First tier is what I would call a blue chip asset. Second tier is basically an asset with a secondary market, but it may not be the best example of the artist. And third tier is really, a bad example of the artist and or no secondary market. So if you look at all of these categories of analysis that I've presented, who is the artist? And I'm always saying it within the context of whether or not it sells at auction. Does the artist sell at auction? What is the medium? When was it created? What's the subject matter as it relates to why this artist is particularly important? What is the condition? My God, I would never feel comfortable buying an expensive work of art if I did not have a separate and detailed condition report. Who owned it? How rare is it? Sales history. And what is the literature? So basically for me, if there is an A grade next to each of those categories of analysis, it falls under what I call a first tier object. If there's a B grade, it's like being in school, a B grade next to each of those categories of analysis with, you know, some wiggle room here or there, that's really a second tier work of art. And if you have a C next to each of those categories of analysis, we're talking about a third tier level work of art with very little asset value. So when I have clients who say to me, hey, is there a great deal in the market today? Can I go out and buy something great at auction? I say, let's see the object. Let's do our analysis and let's see what grade it gets. And if the grade it's getting is in a C average, don't buy it because it will not hold its value over time. So essentially, you know, that's what I'm seeing in the marketplace. We're waiting for July to see what happens in terms of whether or not serious things are sold online. We're going to track to see if the supply increases, i.e. people are willing to sell and there's a way to sell it. And then we're going to be looking very carefully to November to understand the extent to which it has rebounded or not.
Anita, in your many years of experience, have you ever seen anything like this? Is this unprecedented?
Hello, 2008. No, I actually took a job at an auction house right as the recession hit. That was a mistake. But no, this is, this is very, very helpful to us looking at the recession of, 2009, because we can look at what happened at that time and compare with what's happening today. There are differences. There are major differences. Access to artwork was not the problem in 2009. It was a psychological impact and a financial impact that created stagnation in the marketplace. But the rebound was so fast and so furious, primarily due to the global marketplace. Today, it's a different scenario altogether. We have psychological fear, but it just comes down to logistics. Being able to do what everyone is supposed to do has become difficult. And because the economy is struggling, we have to see what impact it has on these luxury assets. On the one hand, we are seeing more and more clients looking for a first tier with A grade next to each of the categories of analysis, because there is a belief that they will hold when the market is down, as they did in 2009. Certainly by 2011, we were at a full rebound, right? So we're looking to 2009, but until the logistics get worked out, we are in a completely different scenario. Any other questions? All right, well, let's do a little comparison with the collector car market, and I think we'll all be very surprised at how similar these markets really are. I'm going to mute now.
Yeah. Thank you, Anita. I love being part of these webinars and attending them because I get to learn from people like yourself and Charles, and I think you're going to hear a lot of similarities between the art market and the collector car market. Anita, if you can advance to the next slide real quick. Before we get into what's happening in the market, which is what everybody's really interested in, I like to define what a collector car is, because that term is very, it can mean a lot of different things to different people. For a lot of people, it's equivalent to old car, and that's simply not the case anymore. I like to use the term enthusiast car when I describe the market, just because it has more breadth to it. It's not just pre-war Duesenbergs or 57 Chevys. We're also talking about cars like a brand new Ford GT, much more modern, as you can see in the cars on the picture here. The key here, the common thread, is that these are cars that are purchased out of passion and for the experience. They're not purchased for transportation or anything like that. And there's no age limit, there's no budget restriction either. You can have a $6,000 car that's considered collectible even. So I like to throw that out there just so that you can understand the breadth of the market that I'm talking about. If you can go to the next slide, please. Before we talk about what lies ahead, I think it's important to establish where the last normal was. And the fact is, 2020 started out actually really strong for collector cars. It was encouraging. 2019 in particular was an off year. Most notably, there's a series of auctions, kind of the biggest event in our world that happens in August. It's around the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. Literally thousands of cars sell. It tends to be very high end. sales year over year in 2019 for that series of auctions was down 34%, so it was substantial. Caught me by surprise. It caught a lot of people by surprise, the magnitude of the flip, and it set off a lot of alarm bells. So that was kind of like setting the stage for where things were at that point in 2019. A lot of people were concerned. You can go to the next slide.
So Brian, that being said, Pebble is one of the more elite auctions that occurs. Did we learn anything from that market cycle being down last year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the lesson that really shined through is that especially at the upper tiers, those buyers are obsessed with perfection. So any cars that had questionable stories, they had maybe some gaps in ownership, or they carried a different engine than maybe they were born with. If they were anything other than perfect, there was very little interest. Those cars that did have good stories, did have documented provenance, perform well. There just weren't enough of them on the market for sale at those auctions, and so the sales took quite a hit as a result. Now, fast forward to January, or looking in the rear view to January, a lot of people were tentative and they were wondering what was going to happen at the next major market event that happens in Arizona. That market tends to be a little bit more accessible. The average sale price is, perhaps around $80,000 versus the Pebble Beach sales, it's around $400,000, $500,000. The good news was the sales were only down 3%. So there was still a decrease in year-over-year totals, but in light of what happened in Pebble Beach, people kind of sighed a relief. There was some stabilization, which was very good. Adding to that, Barrett-Jackson is probably the biggest company that sells at that venue. They've been selling cars for 40 years in Arizona. They had the best year that they've ever had. They had record totals. They set a number of world records for cars selling there. So really encouraging news there. If you go across the country, in Florida, there was another sale that happened. Dana Meekum and his auction company sells thousands of cars over 10 days, right around the same time. This car here on the screen, 1967 Ford Mustang, actually sold for $3.74 million. Now, obviously, this wasn't any Ford Mustang. This was Steve McQueen's Ford Mustang. And it wasn't just Steve McQueen's Ford Mustang. It was the Mustang that he famously drove in the movie Bullitt, which is generally regarded as the greatest car chase scene of all time. Great history on this car, very well known. First time it had been offered publicly, set a record, exceeded expectations, very encouraging sign. So you kind of get back to that, obsession with perfection. This was a perfect car, perfect story, not condition-wise, but just in what it represented, and it performed really well. So that demonstrated there was still an appetite for these types of cars there.
Hey, Brian, I got a question here from the audience about the Arizona auction. Was there a segment of cars that performed really well and sold really well in Arizona this year?
Yeah, I think, there are always surprises at auction in terms of what does well, but to generalize, cars from the 80s and 90s that had very low miles, essentially new enthusiast vehicles, set records. That's what we saw the most of. So there were two late 1980s Toyota Supras, not the Mark IV, which is the most talked about model, but the Mark III. They both had sub 200 miles on one day. One of them set a record at about $71,000. The following day, that record was broken at an $80,000 sale. So that's a good example of the ones that were attracting a lot of attention. Nita, if you could go to the next slide. And actually past this one even. We all know the world looks different, right? I mean, that's why we're really tuned in today. Social distancing measures are in place, stay-at-home orders, all that kind of stuff has made auctions in person either outright prohibited or just irresponsible, depending on where you live. And we've seen just a whole slew of cancellations happen from, this slide talks about through May, but actually last week, Pebble Beach Concord Elegance announced that they were canceling their event for the year. And immediately after that, several auction companies that hold court in Monterey also canceled their events. So, the big thing here is that, most car buyers aren't buying and selling at auction, but what the auctions do are they provide a very visible window and they give you information both on the buyer and the seller side for people to understand what's happening. And so they can feel informed about, market activity. Once that window closes, people have little information and they start to make uninformed decisions. And that's really the key here. That's one of the big impacts, setting aside the fact that these are real businesses that can't function in the way that they have before. So next slide, please. So obviously, lots of activity shifting online because that's still a way that people are able to interact. We've seen some traditional auction companies like RM Sotheby's start to figure out how to conduct a sale online. And they've done that with some success. They've proven the model works, and they're actually intending on replacing their sale in Pebble Beach, which tends to be many multi-million-dollar cars, with an online sale of about 150 high-end cars. So we'll see how that performs, but they're trying to figure out how to continue on. Then buying and selling cars online is not a new phenomenon. eBay Motors really, has been around for 20 years. But there are enthusiast sites that have picked up a lot of activity. The one that's on the screen right now is called bringatrailer.com. They're about 5 years old in terms of buying and selling selling cars on their platform. And March for them was the strongest month they've ever seen. So they set records. They have a great reputation for curating really interesting cars. They have a vetting process that helps ensure that the cars are represented properly. And then they have a community aspect, which is able to comment on the cars as the auctions are happening. And so this whole process brings a lot of transparency, and it brings a lot of, assurance for buyers that what they're seeing is what they're getting, which helps a lot. The cars do tend to be a little bit lower value, but nonetheless, that's, a lot of activity. I'll just add, April, not over yet, but they're poised to break their records in terms of users and bidders as well this month. So we've seen a big uptick. I've got a couple of slides, so Nina, you can go to the next one, just showing that Bring a Trailer did not taper down on the volume of sales that they had in March. But yeah,
Brian, can I ask you a question? Yeah, because
absolutely.
this relates to the art world. So you have Pebble Beach, and like part of Pebble Beach is just the wealthy horde mentality, to all be in an event and put your hand up, and what that means and how that impacts sales. And I know that's a big part of the art fair scene as well. Certainly in auctions like Scottsdale fine art auctions, like it's about the event, right? That's what it's about. So do you think that will have an impact on sales, the fact that the event part is not there?
Yeah, I've talked a lot about this. I'm not, yes, I think it will have an impact. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to look like, because we're going to have, there isn't as much of a push to have those sales at that week when there isn't that anchor event and all the activity that kind of centers around it. So it'll all depend on how people respond. And I think, I just talked about this the other day with somebody. Those events are all about the cars, but really the cars are all about the people, and that's what people are interested about with going to those events. So I believe that some way, somehow, people are going to find a way to get that connection outside of Pebble Beach in the short term. What that looks like, I don't know, but I think that there will be a lot of opportunities for people to get creative in terms of how they can sell cars centered around those types of whatever pops up, I guess. That's a great question. Thank you. So here's a quick slide. Bring a Trailer. In a crisis, we might expect the volume to slip or the sell-through rate to slip. That didn't happen. And then on the next slide, you can see that the prices paid are consistent with what we have seen in the past. So those red dots, didn't fall off a cliff. People were paying the same amount that they have in recent history. So those are encouraging signs for us. Next slide, please. So again, not everybody's buying and selling at auction. Hagerty, by virtue of the fact that we insure over 1 million people, we can see what people are adding and removing from their policies. Again, in a crisis, we would expect that activity would just stop. What we've seen instead is that actually we had slightly more activity in March in terms of people adding and removing cars, which for us is a substitute for buying and selling. So that was positive. And on the next slide, really briefly, people were the activity came down a little bit, but people were still buying more than they were selling. So this is talking about collectors adding cars to their garage, not all selling them. And the values that were coming on were actually more than the cars that they were selling. So they weren't. We didn't see people actually trying to free up cash from their collections.
So Brian, like a lot of people on the call today, they have global buyers. What does is the global market impacted similar to the U.S.?
Yeah, I would say it's impacted more so, actually. Just because I was just talking to a colleague of mine in Germany the other day, and I asked him how the market was, and he kind of chuckled. He said, "What market?" The restrictions that are in place in Europe are much more widespread and unified, I guess. Here in the United States, there are certainly logistical challenges with trying to transport cars or buy cars from afar, but there's still municipalities where it's a lot easier to do than in others. In Europe, that isn't really the case. There have been a lot, an essential business is kind of defined the same everywhere. So that's his take. I think it's a lot harder for people to actually get into it. The market essentially has been on pause. Everybody's waiting to see, because they're expecting restrictions to be lifted soon, what hitting the play button looks like. It could be a race to the bottom. That's the fear. Too many cars coming on at once, an oversaturation of supply. But it's just too early to tell as far as that goes.
Thanks.
Next slide. I've been talking a lot about, the online sales are more kind of mainstream. But when you look at blue chip cars, those are continuing to sell too. Now, Anita defined blue chip car art or assets. The same really applies for cars. These are cars that have long been viewed as desirable. They have a global appeal, limited production. They're significant either for their design or their engineering, their technical aspects. So those have sold. RM Sotheby's has brokered lots of private sales. And recently they did one for this car featured here. It sold for a strong price. Other auction companies have done similar and announced some private sales. Dealers I've talked to have brokered sales. So this is happening. A lot of people don't feel like, or I guess a lot of people believe that auctions are the primary destination for these cars, and that's not necessarily the case. A lot of them trade privately and under the radar anyway. So people are still, managing to do this. And even looking at Hagerty's insured data, over the last 30 days, there have been 10 sales above that $3 million mark. So that is encouraging. Next slide. Actually, you can advance to Anita. So what lies ahead? That's the big question. I always tell people, I don't know. So that's not the answer that people really want to hear when they come on to something like this. But the fact is, I want to stress, this is early days. I mean, we're very early in this process. We don't know what a recovery is going to look like for the global economy. It could be a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery. So it's important to understand that. I talk about kind of a range of possibilities or scenarios that I look back at history through previous downturns and kind of say, this is how these assets performed in the past. This is likely to happen this next time as well. So the first one is blue chip collectibles are likely to appreciate. These are investment grade cars. They, in past downturns, like I can look at the last recession in 08, 09, we saw cars take a hit in value by about 30% from peak to trough. But what happened was those cars appreciated quicker, they recovered faster. And one of the reasons is, people start to look at traditional investments and there's more risk that they carry. Their returns are less sure. And so they hedge a little bit by getting into tangible assets. Art people might buy art, car people buy cars. So that's something that we've seen. Now, one of the interesting things here is that the car market really peaked in 2014, let's say. And a lot of cars have come down at the blue chip level from, maybe 10 to 15 to 20%. So if you think about that 30% change that we might see, we're not talking about from today. Those cars have already sort of peaked. So there is an opportunity there that makes this attractive. Blue chip cars, Anita mentioned the ability to transport art. Cars have that same ability. They're very transportable. So a lot of people find that attractive because if a market in one location might take an outsized hit, there still might be a buyer in Hong Kong, for example, that you could get the car to, depending on logistics. So that's something to look out for there. I've got a couple of other scenarios, probably less applicable to this crowd, but cars in general, these mainstream cars, the $50,000, $60,000 enthusiast vehicle, they're likely to mirror the global economy. So they'll probably come down in value when those buyers feel like they have some financial certainty or security. They might get back into buying again, but they're probably going to pause in the long term. That's probably most likely. And then cars that were in decline, probably going to stay down. These are cars that were sort of falling out of favor to begin with. they'll have an accelerated decrease because of what we're seeing right now. And then there just won't be a sustained interest coming back. Those are cars like pre-war mass-produced American cars, like a Ford Model A, for example, or 1950s American big fins in chrome sedans, that type of thing. Last slide here, I'd want to talk about, so the cars that are going to do the best, I get back to kind of the last normal obsession with perfection, people who are really demanding the best. Those are the cars that are going to continue to perform. That doesn't change. We'll still be in a buyer's market, and that's what they're valuing. And just like you know, this ABC sort of classification, those cars that are in the best condition, either perfect restorations recently done by a great shop, or impeccably preserved original examples, those will do well. Those cars that have a perfect documented history, they're known quantities, and that's actually something that's driving a lot of purchases in the blue chip market now, is a lot of these cars are known, they've been shown, they've received awards, their history is well understood. So being able to see that car in person at that level is actually not as big of a hindrance, or that inability, because people know these cars so well already. And then for cars that maybe have a little bit more mass-produced numbers, those ones that are set apart by having desirable option combinations, it could be a color, you know, a unique and attractive paint job, or rare options that it's equipped with, are really going to set it apart. That's what collectors are looking for, and I don't see that changing as well.
Great, thank you, Brian. And we had a lot of questions come in, but we're gonna, due to time, we're gonna go ahead and move on to Charles, and we can get to some of those questions answered another time. Charles.
Sounds great.
There we go. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me on. It's always fun to talk about the art market. And I have to say, I've been really surprised at the resilience of the market in spite of current trading conditions. And it will be fun to share that with you. You could advance the slide. I think it's always useful to have a little bit of background. I felt that the finish in 2019 was actually really strong. It wasn't a record year. 18 was a record year. 18 was in 2018, the rare wine at auction sold more than it ever has in the history of the category. There was an exceptional run, particularly on Burgundy wine, that drove it, to heights that it had never seen before. And so it was inevitable, I think, that the edge would come off a little bit in 2019, and it did. There were $438 million in sales, which was off about 3% from the total in 2019. But the decline in the overall market can be attributed to one particular single owner sale that happened in 2018 that sort of pumped numbers up, and there was no way we're going to recoup that in 2019. If you factor out that particular sale, then most of the other categories were still up. The sales grew in the United States, sales grew in Hong Kong. In Europe, they went down because of that sale, which happened in Geneva. So the numbers out of Europe didn't look so great, but the numbers in the UK were up, not as significantly as they were in the US, but there was a lot of volume going through the pipeline, and prices still stayed very high. After the record year in 2018, I was really expecting a big correction, or maybe not a big correction, but I was expecting prices to correct a little bit, particularly in that key Burgundy category, which we'll talk about the category dynamics in a little bit. But in spite of that, I was advising private clients that I was buying for at auction to be a little conservative. I said prices are at record levels, and you don't want to overpay, especially in a really hot market. So bid, an increment above the low, or so maybe bid up to the mid estimate, but don't go up to the high. And prices were, even in December, were well above the high estimate for desirable property. And that's not the fault of pessimistic estimates or auction houses that were trying to draw business in with unrealistically low estimates. It was really selling there, and I was absolutely shocked. And that was in a climate that we think this climate is bad, and it is horrendous. But the climate in the fourth quarter of 2019 also had problems. I mean, there were riots in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a huge market for collectible wine, and I was in Hong Kong in November for the sales, and the sales went on in spite of those massive demonstrations that you probably remember. The wine actually sold and did really well, but no one, well, not, I wouldn't say no one was in the sale room, but relatively few people were in the sale room. And it was already starting to transition then in the fourth quarter of 2019 to more action online. I think there are a lot of similarities between the art market and the car market and the wine market, but there are important differences as well. One of the differences is that the average bottle of wine is much less expensive than the average car. So it's relatively rare to sell bottles of wine for more than, say, $40,000. You get them regularly. You know, every sale has scores of them between 10 and 20,000, but to get more than 40,000 a bottle. But the flip side of that is that it's a volume market. There's a lot of wine going through the pipeline to get to the numbers that people chalk up at the end of the day. And that characteristic of the market means that people don't often sit through an entire wine auction. They can go on for, you know, typical wine auction has maybe 2,000 lots, and they go on for 10 or 12 hours. And no matter, you know, how much stamina you have, it's hard to listen, especially if there's 200 lots that have no interest for you at all. So I think people were already sort of prepared for a shift in the dynamic of buying at live auctions, and people were ready to move more towards buying online. There's a fundamental difference in the wine category in that people don't, well, it happens in every category really, but to a much greater extent I've found in wine that people will buy wine usually sight unseen, relying on photos for high value lots, and then it'll be sent directly into storage because it's very important with wine that it be kept at 55 degrees and 80% humidity. So people will buy, the auction house will ship it from their storage facility to the collector's storage facility, or a lot of collectors will even store at the same facility and they shift it over in the computer and become somebody else's property. And then the savvy ones hire somebody to go in and inspect it later. But a lot of the transactions occur like that. So to me, that is a market that was tailor-made for the sort of transition that we're seeing now. And I think the resilience of the market is due partly to that characteristic. So anyhow, we had a strong year, 2019, with the exception of that Henri Jaillet sale. 2020 started off with a serious stumble. One of the characteristics of the market that's developed in the past 10 years is that January's become a really important time. When I first signed on as head of department at Christie's, there weren't sales in January. Everybody went skiing, you took your kids on vacation, there were no sales. That all changed when Hong Kong changed their laws in 2008 and decided to allow wine auctions, and they removed the tariffs from wines. And then that period in January became a really important selling period because Asian clients would buy in advance of Chinese New Year. And if you had the sales early in January, you could usually finish the fulfillment before Chinese New Year came. It depends when Chinese New Year falls, but it became a really important selling period. And none of them took place this year because COVID in January was already an issue. And so that got off to a slow start. Overall, throughout the first quarter, the volume through the pipeline has been consistently lower. It's about half of what it was versus the first quarter of 2019. So it looks better than the 75% Anita was talking about, but it's still 50% is 50%. I think partly what the truth of the matter is what Brian was saying about cars, the same is happening with wine, is that the same level of property is not coming to market. And I think you're still seeing collections get consigned. There's a lot of sales coming up in May and June, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I think the really star quality lots, those those first tier, triple A mint collections of really rare wines are not coming out. People were still consigning them in 2019 in spite of the question marks about Hong Kong, because the sales were still there and people were able to go in person. But now that that's no longer the case, I think people are reluctant to take a risk on selling the absolute top tier property. That being said, there are certain things that are feeding the market. There definitely are estate sales that are ongoing. There are distress sales that are happening that we see. There are merchants and restaurants that are selling the rare wines that they have in their collection at auctions. So there's definitely volume out there, but it's nowhere near the level of 2019. That being said, the sales that took place in March were still very strong. I was at sales. The last sale I attended in person was March 7th, and that was an auction that was tied to the annual La Paulée event, which is a Burgundy-focused thing. Zacky's has a big sale, and they sold just shy of $10 million worth of wine at that sale, and it was 99.8% sold. So exceptional sell-through rates, a big volume sale for the wine category, and Acker Merrill did the same thing just after that with another $10 million sale that was nearly 100% sold. You could go to the next slide. And even into April, there was a $7.6 million sale from HDH in Chicago that was 100% sold. And by that point, of course, we were in the new mode. So the La Paulée sale and the Acker sale in March were still in-person sales. They were the first week in March. The HDH sale was conducted entirely online, which, as I said, is sort of tailored really to the category. But there's an important difference in the way we're doing it now as opposed to the traditional way that online auctions have been done. Usually, I used to think of online auctions as the scratch and dent bin. And when I was at Christie's, we would just shuffle off any stuff that we didn't want to put. If it was a low value lot, or it wasn't that interesting or very rare, or if there were condition issues, we'd just sell it online, and people would. They're timed sales, so they take place over 2 weeks, and the bids accumulate, and then they close on a given date. And there is really little action until the very end of that 2-week period, and they usually close on Sunday nights. So you stay home on Sunday in your jammies and you watch the computer and you bid on the lots that you want, and you get a few. It's stuff for drinking usually. But that's completely changed now. The way they do it now is to hold an auction in a room with no audience, but they have an auctioneer at a rostrum with a hammer, and it's done in real time. So I call that a live online sale. It's a completely different thing than a traditional online wine auction. And the truth of the matter is that really the market has adapted extraordinarily well. We have the advantage in the wine category of being able to do something that you can't do in the car or the art category. Is we can still drink at home, and most of us have been doing plenty of that during the confinement period. But what the auction houses will do is they'll sponsor online drink-a-thons. Well, sort of. They do these big Zoom things. Everybody orders wine or takes wine out of their cellar, and they all get on Zoom, and we drink together, and half of them fall asleep. But that's a very common thing. There are dozens of them happening every day, and often it's not. I'm a participant, but it's helping keep the interest there in the category, and it's helping to keep people buying wine. And I think overall, what's going to happen going forward is that's only going to build. What I've been noticing is that at the end of, even in December of 19, wines were still selling in or at or above the mid estimate. And that's off really strong estimates. And now I notice when I go to these online sales, that their wines are selling around the low estimate, sometimes the reserve, which is usually pegged 1 increment below the low, or sometimes 2 increments below the low. But usually the buyers are savvy enough to suss out exactly where the reserve is, and they don't go too much above it. I think what's going to happen is that general softness is going to push prices online down a little bit, and push estimates down, and then the hammer prices will go back up to sort of mid estimate. the market will find a new equilibrium. Speaking of the experience of 2008, that's exactly when I was working at Christie's, and that's what we found. We'd have a sale. It was the middle of the financial crisis, and we were thinking, oh my gosh, this stuff is never going to sell. So we'd ring up the consignor and say, can you drop your estimates by an increment? And we'd sort of twist his arm a little bit. He'd agree to drop the estimates, and the stuff would sell through. And the wine category actually came out of the '08 financial crisis relatively quickly. By June of '09, the sales and prices were back on track, and they kept going up. The actual peak of that market, they continued to climb from that point to the beginning of 2011. That was really the previous peak to the market, and then there was a correction after that with issues largely tied to issues in Asia, and then it built back up again. Now we're seeing a correction, but I don't know if the trough is going to be as deep as it was in 2009, because I think the market is sort of starting to self-correct. So I think prices will soften and then probably shore back up. We could probably.
Charles, sorry to interrupt. I have two questions for you. One is there's supposedly there's a wine glut in the market right now. Can you speak to the wine glut that is supposedly happening right now?
There's definitely a wine glut in the primary market, in that they planted too many vines in California, and California is drowning in juice, and prices in the bulk market have dropped out of sight. And if you don't have a signed contract, you're going to have trouble shifting your grapes. But that has little to do with the collectible market. The collectible market is the secondary market is 10 or 20 vintages behind that. And so that's not something that's going to have a lot of direct impact on the collectible market. And I think quite the opposite. Going to what Anita was saying about the supply to the art market, I think, the top collections aren't coming to sale anymore. And so there's actually a dearth of the most desirable property. And there might be a slight oversupply of second tier property and third tier property, but that stuff is selling online because of the structures of the category, making it possible to move relatively easily to online sales. And you had a second question as well?
Yeah, the second question was, the auctions have changed, as you mentioned. Has the buyer changed?
I don't get the sense that the actual customer has changed. We've had a slow shift in demographics that's happened over the last, it's really been an interesting progression over the last 20 years. So it used to be something that was very focused in London. It was a European thing, and Americans didn't have sellers. American sellers really started in the mid to late 90s, and there was a huge ramping up of interest in wine collecting in America for about the next 10 to 15 years after that. Then that demographic sort of aged, and Americans, as you get older, you gradually realize that actually 20,000 bottles is probably going to last you a long time, and you don't have to buy that much more, and it sort of drops off a little bit. But what saved us really back in '08, '09 was a gigantic influx of demand from Asia. It was really triggered by Hong Kong changing their laws, and then the mainland started developing more and more collectors as people decided that it was better to drink wine than baijiu. And so that really carried the market for a number of years after that. Then what happened is Americans started buying again. And so you have a very young demographic in Hong Kong that's getting into it now and is probably going to stay at it for the long term, and a somewhat aging demographic in America that, because of the affluence and the success that we've had until fairly recently in the economy, the Americans have also been buying, and I've been signing new advisory clients in America, and they're still buying in spite of this. We're shipping them wine. The thing that really encourages me is that the pipeline is there. The logistics are there. We're still able to auction out. I'm not doing it personally, but auction houses are picking up collections, and warehouses are delivering wine, all with the appropriate social distancing. But the market is still functioning, and thanks God, because everybody's still drinking. Shall we go on to the next slide? So this is sort of what we were just talking about, the market mechanics in the COVID era really I think the only things additional to point out that we haven't already discussed on this particular slide is that assessment and inspection are largely done remotely, and that's something that's possible in the wine category in a way that's not really realistic. Just because the average bottle price is much less, people feel less hesitant about it. Because even if it's $1,000 bottle or a $2,000 bottle of wine, that's nothing like $1 million painting or a $2 million painting or a $200,000 car. It's really, and traditionally the auction houses have been, fairly flexible. The wine is all described, it's cataloged and described in detail, but you can do that for the most part remotely from photographs. You can't really do the fine points of authentication to see but what I usually advise people is if you can't look at it in person, don't buy any unicorns. The really super rare stuff where you might really have to question the authenticity really closely. That's the kind of stuff to stay away from. But the nuts and bolts, the unopened cases of Domaine de la Romanie Conti that are out there with the band still on from the winery, you can be relatively certain. So my clients send me out to inspect them in person, but typically there's a lag of 6 months to a year before I look at it. And if I ever notice something, and it does happen in a small minority of cases, I just write a nice letter to the place that they bought the wine from, and they always take it back. There's been 1 or 2 issues with pushback, and then you just have to dig in your feet, and then they take it back anyhow. So I think, because wine is a slightly different category, it's possible to do assessment and inspection remotely, and everybody's sort of moving to that standard. So we can go on to the next slide. Is it time to buy or time to sell? So what I always tell people is to buy on the way down and sell on the way up. And now we're on the way down, so you should definitely be buying. There's wines that you want to buy and wines you don't want to buy. I think what you really want to buy is to look at categories that are languishing a little bit, because those are the ones that are going to lose value most quickly. And it's really very easy. Burgundy is sharply up over the last 5 years, and it continues to be strong in spite of current conditions. Bordeaux had a sort of 30% correction beginning at the start of 2012. It started to come back a little bit, but the COVID era has completely destroyed that renaissance, and the prices are now back to where they were at the trough in 2012. So Bordeaux is really soft. Bordeaux, though, is at least 50% of the turnover of the secondary market in general. It's a vast number. Everybody needs Bordeaux, and now is the time to buy Bordeaux, and anybody with disposable income should be looking really hard at older vintages of Bordeaux with good provenance that's in top condition, because it's out there and the prices are only going to languish. I think Champagne is very strong, and Champagne has a unique situation, and it's the one category that was exempted from tariffs. Well, it's one of the categories, but in fine wine, collectible wine, it's really the only one, because you're going to pay a 25% tariff, but if you bring something in from overseas. A lot of the wine that gets auctioned in the States, well, it's really a very global market. A lot of the wine is lying in Hong Kong when it's sold, or lying in the UK in particular in storage, or in France and hasn't moved. And wines that are sold here are often shipped to Asia or sometimes to Europe. And with the Trump tariffs in place, it has put a little bit of a slowdown on that global aspect of the market, but Champagne can still come in without paying a tariff. And the wine that's lying in the United States already, which there's a considerable amount of that, is not subject to tariffs, and it's actually looking to be very well priced vis-a-vis the primary market. So I think really it's there are aspects of the current situation that make trading more difficult, but there are other things that actually make it a little bit easier. And so I think it's possible to continue to find really good deals. And at the end of the day, the people who are buying well as prices soften up are going to find themselves in 5 years' time with a collection that's appreciated considerably. I think that's one of the takeaways that I had from the period in 2008, 2009. And I saw the people that had the money I didn't have at that point to buy wine, and the wines they bought are just sick. And the people who are smiling in 5 years' time are going to be the people that bought in the next 6 months. And the other thing that I should mention at this particular juncture is that, you know, if you're on the fence about selling, I mean, there are obviously estate sales, distressed sales, and then there are people who say, you know, gee, the market went up, and maybe now is a good time to lock in some profits and sell. But now is probably not the time to do that if you're not put in that position to have to do it. But there is always the possibility of being able to use wine as a collateral against a loan in order to hang on to the wine and drink it another day, and or further leverage your position. And I've had several clients that have done exactly that. So that's definitely possible as well. Do we have one more slide, or is that it? We do. Current market trends. I know we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to go through this quickly, and most of it was already addressed. We talked about Burgundy being the top category. If you're sitting on top Burgundies that are in great condition and have great provenance, you'll still get good money for them. Bordeaux has given up its gains. We talked about that. Other categories are essentially flat, except Champagne. The tariffs are in place, and Champagne is in a special situation because of the tariffs. The only other thing really about current market trends is that the pound is off versus the dollar, and especially versus Asian currencies. So it's really stimulated a lot of interest among Asian buyers because their money goes a lot further. And for a certain international sort of clientele, the best solution has always been to buy wine wherever it's put up for sale, and to just to leave it there, because you're not usually going to drink this stuff right away. So you can still buy wine in Asia and leave it there. You don't have to worry about tariffs because you're not going to drink the stuff for 20 years anyhow. If you buy it in the UK and it's in bond, then you're not going to pay VAT, and you're not going to pay taxes of any sort because you're going to ship it out of the country, and then you don't pay VAT. So I think, you know, for international buyers, sort of bigger buyers who are able to buy in those global markets and just store it there, leave it there, then it's really a very nice time to buy wine. And I think that's my last slide. Is that the end? Happy to address questions. Yeah.
So one question, Charles, is, and what we're all dying to know is, what is your go-to everyday wine?
Oh, I'd have to say my go-to everyday wine is usually Champagne. In fact, if I reach down by the side of my chair, that is exactly what I find. Bottle of Champagne, and then we have
Of course, it's right by your leg.
Yes, indeed. Oh, there's another one right over there. That's for tonight. So I love Champagne. I love Burgundy. I wrote a book on Burgundy, and so I'm very loyal to Burgundy. And I'm finishing up my second book, which is on Champagne. So you'll be able to buy it soon.
Wonderful. I'm going to thank everyone for joining us on our third webinar. We will be having another webinar in May focusing on distressed assets and whether or not it's a good time for acquisition. So very apropos to everything we've spoken about today. I want to thank everyone from Haggerty for joining us. It was incredibly interesting. And Charles, as always, you are just a wealth of knowledge. Thank you, Nick, for moderating.
Thanks so much.
We will have a video for all of those who would like to have a video copy, or if you weren't able to join us, which we'll send out next week. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Anita. Thanks for having us.
Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.